Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bellingham City Council's committee meetings. We have one meeting this morning, which is the Public Works and Natural Resources Committee, chaired by Councilmember Hannah Stone.
Thank you very much, President Lillquist. Good morning. So we have a few items before us. First, I'm joined on the committee by Councilmembers Anderson and Martins. So we had 3 items before us. I just wanted to note that the first agenda bill item 23667, which was a proposed extension of a facility use agreement for the temporary pop-up gallery at 128 West Holly Street, was removed from the agenda. That was because the potential tenant shared last week that they were not
Councilmember Stone, can we pause? We had a technical issue, so it's not streaming right now.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, we're ready again. Thank you. So now it's like, why is it?
Thank you very much, and good morning. So this is Public Works and Natural Resources. I'm joined on the committee by Councilmembers Anderson and Martins. We had 3 items before us this morning, but one of which has been removed from the agenda. So I briefly just wanted to note that Agenda Bill 23667, which was a proposed extension of a facility use agreement for the temporary pop-up gallery at 128 West Holly Street, was removed from the agenda. The potential tenant shared last week that they're not interested in continuing past the end of the month, which obviates the need for agreement, so that was subsequently removed. The second item on the agenda is Agenda Bill 23668. So this is the Landscape Maintenance Services Bid Award, bid number 9B-2023. The Landscape Maintenance Services bid provides general landscaping, including mowing, pruning, and vegetation cleanup at city-owned facilities. The city received 1 bid, which was publicly opened on February 22nd, 2023. So it's Windwood Enterprises Company of Ferndale, Washington. That was the responsible bidder who submitted the lowest responsive bid of $279,604.03, including any applicable Washington state sales and use tax. Project managers estimate the work was $290,000. So staff recommends award of the bid. And at this time, I'll turn it first to our Public Works Director, Eric Johnston.
Thank you, Councilmember Stone. Nothing further to add to this. This is an annual contract we've sent out for the last several years. We're pleased with the work that Windwood is doing, and we recommend to approve the contract again.
So I'll look to Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I know we've approved this in the past, and given that it's $279,000, I'm just wondering if there has been consideration in the past or current to having this work done in-house. I just kind of see it as that would be several permanent positions with benefits that potentially could be year-round and dedicated to doing the mowing in the summer.
Yes. So we routinely look at these seasonal type contracts as to how we do that. We do hire upwards of about 35 seasonal employees within the Public Works Department. Our assessment at this point in time is that we continue with this particular contract again this year. Happy to revisit in future years, though.
Councilmember Anderson.
Just out of curiosity, when you're looking at whether or not to commit this to being in-house work, so you'll be looking at that again next year and perhaps talking with the Parks Department and stuff? Because I just think it's nice, the accountability to have positions like this in-house if it's possible.
Yes, we do look at this. It's not simply the positions, it's also the equipment and the availability and the peak level, even the workload. But trying to find that balance of full-time year-round employees versus mowing the grass in July is a challenge for us. We're also trying to reduce the amount of work that's being done at these particular sites. So as we try to scale back the amount of mowing that actually needs to be done, so we're trying to approach it from both ends. This particular work is not done in any parks, so this is done at utility sites mostly, and the other locations are locations that are managed by the facilities department of the city, which does not have that utility worker, does not have that year-round service. So trying to find the balance of meeting all of those various needs at various times is something we've looked at for a couple of years, but yes.
Any further discussion from council? Councilmember Anderson.
Move approval.
Okay, so we have a motion to move approval of the bid. We don't require a second. So is there any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all in favor will say aye.
Aye.
No opposed or abstentions, so that passes 3-0, and I'll bring forward that recommendation this evening. The next item before us is Agenda Bill 23669. So the subject is private electric vehicle charging stations in the public right-of-way. Council directed administration to research options for the installation of privately owned electric vehicle charging stations in the public right-of-way. Options fall into two categories. First, a centralized franchise model whereby the city enters into a franchise agreement with one or more EV charging vendors. The second is a decentralized permit model whereby residents and businesses apply to the city for permission to site privately owned EV chargers in the right-of-way adjacent to their properties. City staff have gathered information on the subject and researched programs in other municipalities. For this, once again, I will turn to Public Works Director Eric Johnston.
And I'll turn to my left to City Engineer Chad Schulhauser, and to my right to Mr. Matt Stamps, who helped prepare this agenda item.
Thank you, Eric. So staff took your last meeting when we talked about EV charging stations, and we've gone out with phase one of our EV charging implementation grant and installed a number of facilities across the city. We'll be out for phase two this summer. In total, we'll have 90 plugs in the city, on city property and in the city right-of-way by the end of this year. In looking at that, council asked us to, what about private charging stations? And so we got together with the council staff as well as legal department and public works to determine what that would look like. We've put it all in the memo, but just to summarize the memo, we really see that there's two options on this. Is we could treat people like a franchise, treat vendors like a franchise utility, like we do Puget Sound Energy or Cascade Natural Gas, to allow them to put their facilities in the public right-of-way, and then they would manage and control those facilities. The other option would be to have basically every citizen who was interested in doing something like this act as their own franchise, which is really untenable from our perspective. So happy to answer any questions here. And Matt Stamps from Legal is also here. He was very instrumental in preparing this memo and getting this information out to all of you. So happy to answer any questions on that. And we're here for information. And really we see this as utilizing our existing chargers that we're putting in under the city capital project program to look at the need and the demand for the chargers in the right-of-way to see how we would move forward with that in the next year. Matt?
I don't have anything to add up at the outset, but happy to answer questions or jump into the discussion once we get started.
Thank you very much. So I guess a couple of quick questions before I open up for council. One, just the two options, right, that were outlined by staff in the memo. I understand there's issues with both, but are those seen as mutually exclusive, where we one or the other, or hypothetically, could they move forward in tandem?
Before we get to that, it might be helpful to take a little bit of a step back and talk about what a franchise is to begin with. That might be a benefit if you're watching. So the public right-of-way is different than private property. We've talked about that over the last couple of years. The city manages the public right-of-way for the benefit of transportation purposes. For some elements, such as a utility, a power utility or a gas line or even a water line, the city issues a franchise to the owner-manager of that facility to use the public right-of-way space for that purpose that's not directly related to a public transportation purpose. What that requires is that the franchisee agrees to certain conditions, including removing, replacing, getting rid of, maintaining a good order that privately owned facility. So a franchise becomes, can I use the public right-of-way managed by the city to benefit a private piece of infrastructure? The EV charging stations are kind of a unique element because are they transportation related? I think that's a question that's not been resolved, at least to my awareness, in the municipal industry as we manage public rights-of-way franchises. But the franchise becomes a mechanism issued to either an entity or corporation or to an individual. And so the options that are laid out there, and Matt and Chad can help me with this, is we contract with one person, one entity, one company, one private entity to own and operate and manage EV charging stations on in the public right-of-way at many, many locations. So that's kind of one opposite end of the spectrum. On the other end, we would issue essentially a franchise to each individual property owner or individual who wanted to own and operate a charging station that would be located within the public right-of-way. So if I live on a street and I don't have, for whatever reason, access to a garage or a driveway, if I were to install a charging station in front of my house, owned by myself, to be used by my electric car, the city could issue a franchise to me as an individual. And part of that challenge becomes then that charging station then becomes available to any member of the public, but owned by myself. So kind of a binary question there on opposite ends of the spectrum, and Matt's going to chime in here, but to put into context of the conversation, what a franchise would be is what I was trying to get to. And Matt?
Yeah, that's helpful. And again, Matt Stamps, legal department. So just for terminology, a franchise would be what Eric described, where it would be to a company and authorizing, never just one. The charter prohibits exclusive franchises; it has to be open to all. But it would be for throughout the rights of way in the city or certain areas. When you're talking about an individual with just curbside charging next to their home, it wouldn't be a franchise. It would just be a permit, which is also just helpful in the discussion. So you're talking about a franchise model or a permit model. And like Eric said, there's a couple, the curbside charging, there's a number of challenges with that we think, in my opinion, renders it just not a very good idea. A couple, and they're all in the memo, but a couple of them just to highlight are one that Eric just mentioned, which is if an individual puts a charger out next to their home, that has to be made available to all. You can't have a private parking spot out in the right of way. And so unless they're going to give the power away, they're going to have some sort of mechanism to be charging members of the public. I don't know that that's really feasible for a private owner to have it set up that way. Another thing is any EV charging spot in the right of way under state law has to have signage and pavement paint. I don't know how that's going to go, over with as well with an individual private property owner paying to set that up and have that aesthetic outside the house. Another is when anyone's parked in that spot, they can only be parked there while they're charging, then they have to move on. And so I have a hard time. I don't know. I think in the appendix there's some examples of some municipalities that have tried it, and it's been pretty not widely used because all the expense that homeowner would have to go through in order to provide an amenity to the public, which is really why I think you see it makes more sense for a utility like the city to provide those chargers like we're doing right now, or in some cities they've done it with a public utility district and they'll manage that kind of a program. There's a number of other challenges too, just with private property owners trying to do this. It's expensive, 8 to 10 grand it sounds like. You're going to have insurance required, and oftentimes a homeowner is going to struggle to have commercial general liability insurance. Unlike, say, a restaurant who does a sidewalk cafe, they're going to have that commercial general liability coverage, for example. There's a number of other challenges here. Happy to talk about more of them. Probably best to turn it to council to see what you're actually interested in talking about, though, before we go further.
Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that, these options should be considered sort of independently because it's not one or the other. Technically I could see you could issue a franchise that was operated by, private vendor, but sort of the city, but then you could have sort of one-off permits for individuals. Whether or not that's a good idea is the question at hand, but I just wanted to be clear that they weren't independently exclusive. Technically they could go forward, that both could go forward, so I just wanted to make sure that they were addressed sort of independently. But
I think the other thing, I think that's correct, if I may. One other thing to note, again in the memo, but the city is just launching that current program and with a kind of a 3-year pilot in mind where to get the cost structure in place and to learn, what is the demand, where is the demand, what are the challenges, what's working well, what isn't. And that was one notion that staff came to, which is even if council was interested in taking a look at private charging, in our view, it would be prudent to wait and learn from the program that's just now getting off its feet.
And that was the other question before turning over to the other committee members, was that pilot that was referenced in the memo. I may have missed it, but that you referenced that it's 3 years. Do we have an end date for when that pilot would be deemed sort of completed?
Well, I mean, it's a 3-year window, so there's 2 parts to that. One is installing the charging stations, and 2 is the council established a fee structure for the use of those charging stations. We want to give it enough time to have them be installed, up and operational. That'll be later this summer before all 90 of those plugs become available. And then we want to give it time to say, well, where are they being used? Are people using them? How much adoption is occurring there? One other thing to maybe add to the conversation is this does not refer to any sort of privately owned charging station on private property. Like the Whole Foods level 3 charger that I use, this is not covered by this. That's entirely on private property. So that's separate from this, and we are seeing expansion of that just in the natural growth of that infrastructure.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. And thank you for this report. To me, I can understand why some cities were looking at the private aspect, because some of the larger cities, they don't have alleys, they have street parking. I think in Bellingham, even those who have to use street parking, I think most of Bellingham has alleys where people could access their personal property if they wanted to put in their own charging station. Not all, but I think predominantly a high percentage. So I think the access is a little bit different than perhaps some of the older neighborhoods in Portland where this might be more important. And I also understand some of the limitations of a business wanting to do this, because if a business turns over, who's ultimately responsible? But I'm wondering if there is a process internally that if we have well-established businesses in Bellingham who have been there for a while, and the expectation is they'll be there for, like the Mount Baker Theater or some of the larger housing complexes downtown, like the, Flatiron or some of those locations, if there is an avenue for them to request having the EV charging stations in front of their location for residents or customers, and perhaps a partnership where if someone is willing to put some of the expense in there for the city to be able to help install it, but it would ultimately be the city or perhaps a partnership in order to get it in front of their place sooner.
Eric, that might be a good one for you to field. I think that there's not currently a structure in place where they could apply to do it, to go it alone and have, as just under a permit. But it sounds like that's not exactly what you're asking. You're asking if they could apply to, the city is citing EV infrastructure currently, and could they apply to the city to have one sited in front of their
We're installing
property?
90,
Yeah.
that are city-owned. But I'm just thinking that over the next few years, if we don't come up with a policy or pathway for an individual business to be able to put them in front, but there is interest in it. I'm thinking Faith Life, like if they really wanted to have one in front of their business and we don't have the pathway to give a franchise in front of their building, is there the potential of creating a policy where they could work with the city to get something located sooner, not necessarily the 90, but if there was a partnership ability that we want it here, maybe not under our ownership, it could be under the city, but we could help with some of the cost burden in order to get it sooner than later. I'm just thinking that might be like a 0.5 or version B to this. There may not be a lot of takers for it, but I could see some of the businesses that would need to use the right-of-way because they don't have the private property, like say Grizzly could put their own in because they have plenty of private property for their parking lot, but some of the businesses downtown don't have that.
I think we would be open to that. We don't have a procedure that's formally set for that. We have accepted the donation of charging equipment to be installed on city parking lots in the past. We have done that. We'd be open to those proposals from a business who wanted to say, I'd like to help install a charging station at location X, Y, or Z. We would need to assess the question of prioritization and which ones go where, what's the city's role for that, what is our obligation to maintain and operate that through the standard process of which essentially becomes a donation to the city, is one way to maybe think about that. If you'd like to help participate, we'd be open to that conversation, but we don't have that formalized, and that would be version 3.1, or as you mentioned, option B for this. But we're supportive of that public-private partnership. The challenge becomes is, do you divert resources away from our existing program to focus on that one, and what's the benefit there? But we would be open to that.
It might be useful to have that articulated so that people know that it might be an option.
Yeah.
They may not take us up on it. I can see what's in this packet not necessarily being viable currently, but I could see a business perhaps having interest in getting them in front of their place, but not necessarily a franchise situation.
If I might, you could do something like that. I mean, right now, although we're calling, I refer to it as a pilot, the current rollout, and it's only a pilot, it's permanent in terms of the infrastructure that's going out in the program. It's a pilot only in the sense of the cost. If you guys will remember, the fee structure is based on a market-based fee currently, with the goal of shifting to a cost-based fee. We don't know the costs until the program gets run for a few years. But the idea is that's going to be an ongoing program with an update to the fee structure within the 3-year period. But that same kind of program, I think that in talking to staff, is intended to, if it goes well, to proliferate further, in which case you could, in siting, accept interest from the community and look at siting it there, not even as a public partnership, but just as a city rollout, which simplifies things, actually, than instead of having to work with the property owner to deal with the money. It's a lot more straightforward if the city just handles that, and there's a lot of, to my knowledge, grant funding and things like that available for these stations.
Other questions or comments from committee members before I open the floor to the rest of the council? No? Okay. Councilmember Hamel?
Yeah, just more of a general question in terms of utility taxes. How do utility taxes work with this, whether it's privately or a franchise model or city-owned infrastructure? How does that work?
Utility taxes. So utility taxes, there's a bunch of them. One of is the taxes charged by the city to utilities, or charged on top of the utilities. So the city charges a utility tax on cascade on gas service, on power, on water, sewer, and storm drainage, and there's a franchise fee on cable. But and we have another utility tax that applies to garbage collection. Those taxes are generally on the operating cost and revenues of those utilities. So the creation of a franchise does not necessarily result as a one-to-one creation of a utility tax. So the council would have to take an action to create a tax on a charging station, which would be your prerogative, but the utility tax would not directly apply to that. However, fees for the power charged to run the power station would be subject to the utility taxes that are charged by the city for the creation of the power. I hope were there other thoughts about the utility tax? Or okay. The other thing the city does do with franchises is it in some cases can charge a franchise fee, but some cases those are limited, and I'm not sure how that would apply in this particular case related to an EV charging station. But
Yep, I think that answers my questions.
Councilmember Lillquist?
Yeah, so I've been talking about and suggesting for a couple of years now that we look at curbside charging, and I want to kind of back up and explain where I'm coming from. 30 to 40% of the U.S.'s greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector. Right, it was identified as we need progress in the transportation sector. And I think it's also becoming emergingly clear that the main, or maybe even the only barrier to widespread EV adoption is not the vehicles, but the charging infrastructure. They're affordable, they're reliable, they're clean, it's an established technology. EV cars are not the problem, even EV trucks. And mid-duty and even heavy-duty EV vehicles, right? The difficulty is not on the vehicle side, but on the charging side. And if you are driving in such a way that you can just simply charge at home, because you've got a home and you've got a garage or whatever, and you don't drive very far every day, you can manage. You don't need away-from-home EV charging. But again, the barrier to widespread adoption is where there's no concern about finding EV charging when you're on the road. According to one statistic I just read, there are 56,000 EV charging stations across this country, and more than double or triple that in actual charging ports, because most charging stations have more than one port. Even so, the estimates are to reach our EV charging goals, nationwide I'm talking, we need to triple the number of EV charging stations. Where will this 100,000 charging stations go? Will it follow the current model where they're on private parking lots in front of grocery stores or whatever? Or is there a place for more public charging stations like the 90 that we're putting in? And is there a use for looking for more places to have charging stations? There are millions of cars parked in public rights of way at any moment, and those are charging opportunities. So I think we need to look at that. Of those 56,000 EV charging stations, those are mostly owned by about 30 plus companies, right? Private entities are putting in and running EV charging businesses. And there are apparently 3 companies that own 2/3 of all those charging stations. I don't have an EV car, so I don't know. But there are networks, right? There are big networks, and they go by a variety of names, but the underlying ownership, right, is the large entities who are making a business of this. And they can go to Hagen and say, hey, we run EV charging station nationwide. We would like to rent or use some of your parking lot and put in some charging stations. And the Hagen Corporation, or whoever the heck owns them these days, might say, okay, we could do that. We think of that as a public service to our customers. You've already run the business. You already know how to run that business. I don't need to learn how to do that. I'm a grocery store operator, but you're an EV charging operator, and I will come to you, and we will have a business-to-business relationship. That's how it works. What about another option? What about that same company comes to the city or another public entity and says, hey, you've got a whole bunch of parking space too. It's not a parking lot from a grocery store. It's mile after mile after mile after mile of public right-of-way. I want an open opportunity for that. The whole idea of the onesie-twosie charging station in front of my house, that actually hadn't occurred to me. That actually wasn't the problem I was addressing. I was really addressing the idea of where are all these hundreds of thousands of charging stations going to be in the future? And if we, public entities, control so much of the public parking space, then I think we ought to make a pathway for that curbside charging be possible. I hadn't thought about it in terms of a franchise agreement. I think maybe you're right. I mean, legally, I guess it is a franchise agreement. I thought about it more in terms of a permit system, right? Maybe that's what we call it. This is a kind of permit system. If you're going to use the public right-of-way, here's the rules you need to play by. You need to ask us ahead of time. We need to grant permission. We have rules so that you balance the other uses for the rights of way. Sometimes we say no, but we might say yes. And if we really want that 30 to 40% of CO2 emissions to go away, and we really want to do our part to remove probably the main barrier to electrifying transportation, which is EV charging infrastructure, then I want us to be able to have a pathway forward. I want us to have a system set up so that if one of these companies does come to us, we've already thought about it, and we already say, yeah, here's the paperwork you submit. So that's what I'm hoping for. So is this idea in this memo of a franchise agreement, can we set it up so it's easy? So it works at our end, right? So we have rules ahead of time. We thought ahead of time about when we say no and when we say yes. And then also I'm really willing and prepared to go down to Olympia and start advocating for changing the parking rules, because I think they are a barrier too. Right now it's a zero-sum game. You put an EV charging station, boom, you've taken away regular parking. You can't park there if you're a regular internal combustion engine car anymore. And so there's a zero-sum game going on with parking. And I think in the long term, we're going to have to move away from that zero-sum game. In the long term, I think we need changes in state law. But in the short term, can we at least think about when we would say yes to EV charging in a franchise agreement? So, Mr. Johnson, I see you ready to push the button. What can you tell me about my thoughts of trying to create that pathway if someone comes to us?
Well, I think you're on the right track, is that the option to provide a franchise for one or more providers to install privately owned and operated charging stations in the public right-of-way is a viable option available to the city. If the council were to so direct, the staff would spend time to develop what that franchise would look like and whatever ordinances would need to be put in place to enable that to occur. And I would need to convert with our colleagues at the City Attorney's Office on how to do that, but that would be certainly within the council's direction and prerogative.
Well, I don't know what the committee thinks, but I'm interested in going forward on that.
So, brief follow-up on that. The options presented, right, in this memo, one of them is not the city owning and operating the EV charging stations in the right-of-way, right?
No, because we're already doing that, right? So the narrow request that was given by the council was to consider privately owned charging stations in the public right-of-way. We're assuming that the city is going to continue to install the charging stations that we have, own and operate them, collect the revenue, maintain them, and expand the use of that, and do more of those in the future as we take advantage of the infrastructure money coming out of the federal government, the state government, to put more of those in place. The question is, do we want to make the available more than that to private operators only? And I look to Matt and Chad on this, but I'm not seeing a lot of inquiries from private operators to get those from the city, but certainly council's direction.
Okay. Councilmember Anderson.
Matt's got something to add.
So, and I understand where Councilmember Lillquist is going, because numbers will help change the game. I would prefer that the city is the one responsible for those numbers. Given that there's not a lot of tearing down the doors with other municipalities to do a franchise, it's a lot of staff time and effort if there's maybe one for a few or a couple of dozen. But then we get into that, who pays for the parking space, who does the maintenance, if they leave, what happens with them. And also, I don't want the city to then take a back seat and let it become private enterprise. I want the city to be like, we need more, we're going after the grants. I think, one, it keeps jobs because there's people doing the maintenance, installation, and upkeep. Those are city positions. Generally pay decent and benefits compared to a private company. But I would rather see the city aggressively going for those grants, the funding, to install them ourselves, and that way we have that ability to say where they go, specifically based on where we know it's going to have the highest use. And those private companies can continue their partnership with private companies in their parking lots if they want to do an expansion there. We have a lot going in at Fred Meyer's on the north side. Hopefully we'll see some on the south side eventually. So I think there is the availability for those private companies to come in and do a partnership with a company. But I understand where you're going. It's just, I think the time and effort, given that there's not a lot of interest in much larger markets, is, maybe this could happen, but maybe wait a year or two to see if those other markets start seeing some play and interest in those kind of contracts. We can come back, but I want to put it on staff to keep going after the money and install them as a city venture.
Mr. Stamps or Mayor Fleetwood or Director Johnston, everyone's hands have been raised, so I'll defer to you on the order.
Well, it caused me to forget what I was going to say at the moment, so must not have been that important.
Thank you. So this is a good discussion. It's timely. I've driven a little Leaf for the last 6 or 7 years, and so we all have our unique experiences, those of us that drive electric cars. I have the good fortune of being able to trickle charge at home, and many of the people I know trickle charge, but what if you live in a large apartment complex? I think we're all familiar with the fact that there's been a dramatic increase nationwide just in recent years of the rate at which people are starting to convert to electric vehicles. And for people who follow electrification of vehicles, there's an awareness that all the major car companies have plans to convert to electrification. So this is going to be kind of like that famous picture of Broadway in New York City in 1910 when they took this picture and it was all horse and buggy. And 10 years later, the picture taken from the exact same spot, and it was almost all Model Ts. I think a similar kind of thing is going to be happening in the coming decade. And it's going to be sort of to a point I think you may have been alluding to, Councilmember Anderson. I think there's going to be a dramatic evolution in the free market that's going to respond and deliver a lot of this in the coming years, which isn't to say for a moment there's not a role for the city. There is, and as has been said, we're working on it. I might just, for context, as Councilmember Martins knows, we met with you just last week with some people on the climate team, and there is going to be a presentation to Council, I believe, at the next meeting, just giving you an update on where things are at with climate planning in the city. And that's going to include reference to the fact that over the course of this year, we're going to be doing an update of the Climate Action Plan. So I think we can, if the Council wishes, we can incorporate some thoughts and comments into the update that we provide at the next Council meeting relating to this topic. So there is going to be an opportunity to talk more about this soon.
Director Johnston, did you have anything to add? No. Okay. Yeah, Mr. Stamps.
Okay, I remembered what I was going to say. So on the franchise, we've already got a franchise code in place. We have 2 chapters. One is for cable, one is for utilities and telecoms. I would need to look at it a little more closely, but I sitting here right now, my thought is that the franchise chapter of the code on utilities would be broad enough to cover an EV charging franchise. And the way that that works then is that when a potential franchise holder comes to the city, it's a negotiation. You negotiate the franchise agreement, which is also the ordinance. It's one and the same that comes before council for approval. And generally, once you've negotiated that first one with that first entity for that type, then that sort of sets you have to provide uniform terms for any subsequent comers. So the work would get done if and when we were approached by somebody who we thought was a viable provider. And then ultimately, that would be a council decision on that agreement. It comes forward as an ordinance. So there's not the work would happen if and when someone comes forward, is what I'm trying to say. You wouldn't need to get it all set up prospectively. You would just enter into negotiations if and when someone comes forward. And then the way that works on individual installations under franchises, and this one too, is that the franchise agreement is the umbrella. That's what gives you the general authority to be in the right-of-way. It requires things like bonding, insurance, indemnity, all that stuff. But each installation for PSE or Cascade Natural Gas or anyone else, anytime they're going to stick a shovel in the ground, they come forward and pull a permit under that franchise agreement.
Mr. Fleetwood, did you have?
Just to follow up, another tool that we have that's available to us, in our climate work, we've recently created 2 new work groups, one for building electrification and another for vehicle electrification. And so they're composed of people with special knowledge and interest in these topics. And so there is an opportunity, I think, for us to present them with questions we'd like answered. We've got a really good group that can mull over these things and come back with their thoughts and or recommendations. I'm happy to ask them to make them aware of the discussion that's happening today and asking them to follow up.
Great. Will information about those work groups be potentially included in the update with the climate action, or is that separate?
The update that we'll be providing in 2 weeks will absolutely make reference and go into some detail as to their charge.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Councilmember Lillquist.
I appreciate, Mr. Stamps, what you're saying is that that work would be done if and when someone comes to us with a request. But that puts us in a reactive, passive stance. And I think it's fair to say the city has tried to adopt an active and proactive stance with regard to climate change. And so I think it makes sense for us to develop kind of a prospectus for those potential franchisees, right? So they don't have to say, well, where can we possibly go? What community might be interested? Well, the city of Bellingham already has a prospectus and kind of an invitation. So I guess my request to you, Mr. Fleetwood, is could you ask the transportation team about their opinion about helping to develop a perspective? So that would definitely involve our public works staff, right? Because when the franchise agreement is written, it's I mean, you're in charge of that public right-of-way. Can we develop a prospectus at least, what I'm calling prospectus, even if we can't like pre-write a franchise agreement or pre-write a permitting ordinance?
Yes.
Okay?
Councilmember Hamel.
Additionally, pardon me, I'm interested in what multifamily housing looks like in terms of incenting developers to provide charging infrastructure in apartment buildings, essentially, given that we've had thousands of permits issued since 2015. We were talking about that a couple of meetings ago. I think it was like 4,000 or 4,200 permits. How are we incenting new development to add that infrastructure? How do we incent current housing infrastructure inventory to provide for that infrastructure? And then in particular, how do we work with our community housing development organizations that build subsidized housing? Just thinking about the mayor's comment, while some of those electric vehicles might not be affordable for folks that are living in subsidized housing now, but the analogy of Broadway, in 10 years really changing from horse and buggy to Model T cars, I just assume that price points will go down, or the inventory of used cars will be much more significant than it is currently, and therefore maybe more affordable to folks that are living in 60% area median income households or less. So those are two kind of big paths. One is the private market for new development, the private market for current development, and then the community housing development organizations.
Yeah, the city climate team, of course, includes members from the planning department. This is under consideration. I'll pass on your thoughts to them. We'll have a discussion on it and come back, because you're absolutely right. We need to have a code that incents all of those things.
Councilmember Anderson.
Just a little bit on the code. I believe the state code requires if you have more than 4 units, that the wiring has to be in place for the charging station. So the infrastructure part is there, just not the apparatus. And the previous planning director, I had spoken with him about interest in changing our code that would require the charging station to be put in place, so that we'd go a little bit further than that. So I know Blake is not here, but hopefully that staff will remind him, because I don't think I've had that conversation. It was with the previous director, because, when we were talking about electrification, I think it's really important to actually have the actual station there, but also looking too at new commercial, ensuring that that's part of the code if we're going to get it put in there. So at least the wiring's there.
Councilmember Martins.
Kind of more on the larger scope of all of this, I imagine that a lot of other communities are getting the same, if they're asking their public works, well, how do we go about this, or kind of getting the same answer. So on the subject of obviously leaning towards a franchisee model and having a couple entities kind of take it over, is there any way, instead of waiting for someone out of area to come to us and be the company to do that, that we can help uplift a local Bellingham or Whatcom County company, or multiple of them, to be ready and kind of understand and do their own due diligence on how to have a local company own it, how we can keep this money in our community, because it's kind of like the wild, wild west. And if anyone can kind of get a head start on getting this right and figuring out all of the hiccups, maybe we can empower one of our own to, and I imagine no one's going to have an answer for that right now, but I kind of just wanted to get that out. These seem like these are going to be great jobs a couple years down the line. How do we empower someone local to be the head of that, at least for us?
Councilmember Lillquist.
What Lisa said earlier, I think there already are rules on multifamily, but I think you're right. Part of this came forward to me personally several years ago when there was a new development going across the street from me, and they were required to put in EV charging stations. And they wanted to put in EV charging stations, but they also thought, hey, maybe I could put a few of these on the street. I'm already going to spend a lot of money on putting in charging stations. but only the residents can use them because they're going to be in our private lot. When I could just put them along the street front, then they'd be used more broadly. So that was an eye-opener for me, that there are some developers. These were condominiums, so rather than rental housing. So that's what I was going to say. There already are rules for newer construction that are supportive of EV charging, but that doesn't do anything for many other units.
Just to follow up on Councilmember Martin's comment, I certainly agree and would hope that we can find that local partner. And I know that in the memo it was referenced that while staff's not aware of any EV franchises in Washington currently, that there would be further investigation about who the potential franchises would be and the opportunity, that would generate any interest. So I think that's the starting point, right? And the city will continue with the pilot. And as you said, this is something that the city already does, but having the opportunity to sort of, leverage and expand that rate maybe at a faster, just at a faster rate than we might be able to do individually as a city when we are looking to address the numbers that President Lilliquist was highlighting as far as the impact, right, on the climate work that we're doing, specifically related to transportation and vehicles. So I know that this was for information and discussion only. I don't know if staff feels like they have any formal or sufficient direction at this time, or if there needs to be any formal motion.
I think Mayor expressed a willingness to refer some of this to the climate team, which involves all city departments, and I think that's an appropriate place to have those recommendations come back at some point, and we'll continue to install publicly owned City of Bellingham charging stations at the rate we're able to get them in.
So quick follow-up with respect to the work that the city's doing. When Councilmember Anderson was referencing that, if there's a local business, probably not so much an individual in a neighborhood, right, but more centrally located locations where people are expressing an interest. Is there a way for those requests to come forward to the city, or is that information already being collected?
Probably the best way is just have them reach out to either myself or Chad Schulhauser, and we can start that conversation as we're able to.
I would like to add that the grant dollars that we've got, so if we were to take requests and do all of that, which we do all the time, we would need to budget for that and plan for that. The grant dollars that we're utilizing to put in our 90 plugs right now are all, the criteria have to be selected of where those are located. So we've got, low-income areas, park properties. It all ties into the I-5 corridor charging that WashDOT has done. So just want to put that out there.
And so my understanding then from your comment is that there are requirements about those locations, but not all 90 have been identified yet? Is that true?
They have been. All of those 90 have been identified to that. If we have something outside of that process that we're doing, say, building owner P wants to install a charging station, just have them reach out to Public Works, and we'll facilitate that process.
Great, thank you. Anything further from committee or council? No. Okay. Seeing nothing further, that was the final agenda item before our committee this morning. So if there's nothing further, we will adjourn, and I'll turn it back to President Lilliquist.
Thank you, Hannah. We'll return it after the lunch break at 1 o'clock. We'll continue our committee meetings, the first of which will be Public Health, Safety, and Justice, and a presentation on the Healthy Children's Fund implementation by Whatcom County. We'll see you all at 1 o'clock. We're adjourned.